Hi, I'm Claire Mitchell, QC. Welcome to the Witches of Scotland podcast. I'm a lawyer who specialises in miscarriage of justice cases, and we're bringing you this podcast because we want to tell you about the women who were accused, prosecuted, convicted, and ultimately executed as witches in Scotland.
I'm Zoe Venditozzi, and I'm a writer who's always had an interest in the witches, and I feel that this dark mark against Scotland needs a reckoning.
The campaign Witches of Scotland wants three things. Firstly, a pardon for all those convicted of witchcraft. Secondly, an apology for all those who were accused as witches. And finally, a national monument in recognition of all those who are affected by this terrible miscarriage of justice.
Over the forthcoming weeks, we'll be talking to a whole host of experts about the history and the modern day connections to the Witches of Scotland.
Hi, and welcome to episode 11 of Witches of Scotland podcast. We start, as ever, by naming some of the women who were accused as witches in Scotland.
So our witches this week that we're going to be talking about and naming are, firstly, we've got Jane Weir of Edinburgh. So she was female, unmarried, again, ongoing theme here, and she was executed after a trial on the 6th of April 1670, and that's all we've got for her. And then who else have we got, Claire?
We've also got Margaret Allen. Margaret Allen was a woman who was accused of witchcraft, and we actually have a record of hers in 1661. The record dates from the court in 1661 and is dated 14th of November. And what it says is that she'd been taken to the toll booth of Edinburgh in relation to what's described as points of sorcery and witchcraft mentioned in her ditty. So her ditty was the statement that was taken from her. And what was interesting about this case in particular that caught my eye was that they deserted the allegations against her for some reason. I'm not sure why that was. It doesn't record it in the notes, but it says that she was ordained to be put at liberty after finding that she wasn't guilty of being a witch, and said, and she had to act in good behaviour for all time coming, and that she should never enter upon the boundaries of the lands of New Hall at any time coming under pain of death.
That's quite peculiar. So it was like they didn't try her and find her not guilty, but then they let her go with a warning.
Yeah, exactly. They let her go with a warning, but also banished her from her own land from where she was from. They would have effectively sent her out, and she would just be wandering until she sort of tried to find another community that might accept her. And as I said, people might be very suspicious of women turning up alone in new communities. It wouldn't be long before further whispers would start about them, eh?
I wonder why they let her go, though. That's
it's weird. It doesn't record. It just says the diet was deserted pro loco et compore. Now, we say in the modern day, if a trial has gone off, we say a diet has been adjourned pro loco et tempore. But the old way it's recorded is that desertus the diet pro loco et compore, which just means that the matter is at an end for the time being. I suppose it theoretically meant then as now that they could re-raise it again, and ordained her to be of good behaviour for all time coming and banished her. So poor Margaret Allen was left to wander Scotland, having been accused of witchcraft, never having come to trial, never having there been any proof against her, and had been entirely taken out of her local community. So that's a bit more we know about Margaret Allen of Edinburgh, 1661.
1661, I was about to say, so when was that one? Because the third one we've got is somebody from November 1579, and that's Bessie Dunlop from Ayrshire. Again, this is quite vague, just that she was female and unmarried, and sadly she was executed after her trial.
Well, again, that's three more women we can remember. We've got a great person to speak to us today, Zoe, and I know you might have a particular interest in a part of it because she talks about one of the women having poppets, having been found with poppets. And I think you've done some writing on that.
I have. I wrote a book where there's a character who makes a puppet. She's not exactly a witch, but she can foretell people's deaths. Or she thinks she can anyway. She may just be mad. Well, I leave that up to the reader. But she makes a puppet, though, out of, what does she make it out of? I think wax and human hair, attractively.
Oh, okay. Well, we come to here when we're speaking about the Witches of Ireland, and it's It's truly fascinating as we come to speak about the difference between Scotland and Ireland and in the way the accusations occurred. But we come to hear of a poor woman and her daughter, and she may only have been making toys for her daughter rather than poppets. But we'll come to hear of that shortly. So I'll let you introduce our speaker today.
Paula Kehoe is an Australian-born filmmaker living and working in the Connemara Gaeltacht in Ireland. Her work is informed by an interest in social justice, the environment, language and culture. She's director, co-writer and co-producer of a new series, which we're going to be talking about today, that she's made in collaboration with the producer and co-writer Ashlene Aylward. The 6-part series is a Lagan Media production for TG4 and BBC Northern Ireland. Hi Paula, it's lovely to meet you.
Lovely to meet you too, Zoe.
Paula, we're delighted to have you here today, particularly because we know that you have been involved in a series which you've been producing about witches, I think, since 2017. Can you tell us a wee bit about that, please?
Sure. Well, Ashlene Aylward, in fact, came up with this series probably even the year before. She was fascinated by a figure in Ireland named Biddy Early. I don't know if you guys have heard of her. She lived in 1865. She's known as a wise woman, the wise woman of Clare. She was apparently accused of being a witch. Now, I say apparently because there's not a lot of evidence, but her legend is writ large. Everyone knows Biddy Early in Ireland. That then expanded. Ashlene is based in Belfast, so she got interested in the cases of witchcraft accusations in the north, because most of them did happen in the north. So when she came to me, she had a 6-part series that was basically a drama series, I suppose, that she was thinking of developing as a documentary series. Now, I have to admit that initially I was reluctant because you spend many years immersed in these subjects when you take on particularly a 6-part series. And I thought, do I actually want to be immersed in this subject for that amount of time, this sort of dark subject? But when I started to explore the stories a little further, the biggest question that came up for me was, how come these cases in Ireland, there were so few cases on one hand, but why did they just happen mostly in the north, or there was one case in 1661 in a Puritan Cromwellian community in Youghal. So that became the backdrop, I suppose. We redeveloped the series based on this new lens, I suppose, which gave us a way also of looking at traditional beliefs in Gaelic Ireland, at looking at the process of colonisation and plantation, and why, for example, when there's so much in common between Ireland and Scotland, was there such a differential between the amount of women who were persecuted as witches?
Do you know who the women are? Can you tell us the women's names that were affected?
Yes, of course. Well, in our program, there were very few, and in fact, most of them are actually in the series. But there was a case in 1655. A woman named Marion Fisher was accused in Carrickfergus, that's in the north, for bewitching a man. But then it was discovered that he died of natural causes. So she was pardoned. Which is unusual, but it took 2 years. So, I'm sure she didn't have a great time in the interim.
Well, it's very lucky they hadn't executed her first, because they,
Yes.
So she was still alive.
She was still alive. That's right. That's right. And that case is not very famous. In fact, we don't really cover it in the series because it was a case, she was pardoned, which is very unusual as well when someone's been accused at that time. But after that, so in 1661, one of the most famous cases in Ireland is Florence Newton. Now, she lived in Youghal, which was a Cromwellian Puritan community in the southeast of Ireland. She basically asked for charity. So she asked a young maidservant named Mary Longden for some food, and she was refused. Now, this was quite a big thing to be refused charity. So she met Mary Longden at the well, and she gave her a kiss, which was a bit of a malevolent kiss. She said, "Mary, Mary, I wish thee well," which I presume could be interpreted as the opposite. But Mary Longden then proceeded to have fits. She had spectral visions. She believed that Florence Newton had bewitched her. So Florence Newton was accused of witchcraft, and she was interrogated over quite a long period of time. She kissed one of the prison guards, and he subsequently died. So her case got more and more complicated. She was subjected to torture by using an awl, which is used for leather work. So it's quite a very, big pin, basically. And she died during the interrogation. So she was in her 60s. She was poor. She was not under the protection of a man. So she didn't really have a chance. Just for context, in Ireland at the time, we're looking at not the beginning of, but the process of colonisation is well underway after the Cromwellian Wars. Outside of Youghal, which was a walled community, it was after the collapse of the Gaelic Order. There was a lot of oppression of the native population. The population would have mostly been Irish-speaking and would have had a traditional belief system that would have been quite different to some of the beliefs, I suppose, that came in through the Reformation and the recasting, I suppose, of the supernatural and the other world as a place where the devil and demons existed. We would have had a tradition of the Banfassa, or the wise woman. Goddess worship was still quite prevalent, with a kind of a layer of Catholicism over the top. So, this idea of Mary and Bridget and all of the saints, they would have been kind of incarnations of an earlier form of goddess worship in Ireland that was quite strong. So that gives us a kind of a way of, I suppose, interrogating or asking the questions as to what are the possible reasons why the witch hunts didn't take off in the rest of Ireland. Because while there were very few cases anywhere in Ireland, in the north as well, they were all in either Puritan or Ulster Scots communities.
So is it a theory that because in the communities the women were already steeped in a culture of wise women being acceptable or perhaps appropriate, that the idea of the witch didn't hold the same negative connotation?
That's right. And I think too, the concept of witch in the way that we understand it when we're talking about the witch trials, it didn't really exist in the same way. There was, a Banfassa, or this figure of the Cailleach. Now, a Cailleach can be just an old woman. It's just a word for an older woman. But there is this mythological Cailleach figure in the mythology that is a kind of a creation myth. She creates the landscape. She was there when the mountains were formed and the rivers were formed. It has biblical connotations. There's also the Morrigan, who was a warrior goddess and a shapeshifter, and she became a crow. And in the mythology, for example, in the Táin, we have Queen Maeve, who was a wild woman, and she was not a good woman. They were kind of bawdy, lusty, independent, uncontrollable figures. And so I think it's easy to romanticize it, perhaps, and there's been suggestions that women had more agency under the Gaelic Order and under Brehon law. I don't really think that's the case. That doesn't seem to be the case. However, there was something that women in particular had access to in the other world that may have protected them in some way, or they could find protection in it because it was both respected and feared.
Ah, okay. So because of that respect and because of that fear, people might be less likely to cast aspersions about them.
True. And also, though, this idea of the other world, everyone believed in it, where the fairies lived. It was a parallel dimension. It wasn't like Tinkerbell type of fairy. There were all kinds of people there. It was the realm of the gods. And it was a place that people lived with. The devil didn't live there. It wasn't a place full of demons. It wasn't an underworld. It was an otherworld. So it existed in a parallel dimension. Portals to it were in the landscape. They were in holy wells, in hills, under the earth. So it goes back to the ancient legend of the Tuatha De Danann. When the Milesians came to Ireland, the Tuatha De Danann went underground. And
sorry, I was just going to say, because I'm really quite taken with that one thing you just said there was no devil in the fairy world.
No, the devil wasn't part of that, pantheon of characters. No, fairies weren't exactly like Tinkerbell. They weren't, there were good fairies and bad fairies, but it wasn't such a binary dichotomy, I suppose. It was a complicated relationship between, I suppose, people in the landscape. You could interpret it in that way as well. There were ways of behaving towards the landscape encoded in these beliefs. For example, certain wild areas where you didn't mess with them. If there was a circle of hawthorn trees, for example, you didn't cultivate that area. You left it because this was an area where the fairies lived. Now, how do you interpret that today? Perhaps there were reasons for that, perhaps to do with biodiversity. I don't know. I mean, that's me probably making things up there. But I would like to think that there was an understanding of the environment that perhaps we couldn't even possibly understand today because we're quite disconnected from it.
Yeah, certainly. I think, I mean, you only have to go camping to make you more appreciative of the land around us and to make us more appreciative of what we see and what we hear, even when we're out camping for a weekend. But you can imagine living on the land and in the land in that very practical way where you weren't separated from it, being a whole different matter, that people were very in tune with what they heard and how they interpreted it.
Exactly. And water is life. Wells were places where you could get clean water, and that the water would have different qualities depending on the land, depending on how it was filtered, whether it came through the earth. So there was a lot of, ways of respecting the landscape. I mean, look, that's one way of thinking about it. But I suppose through this process, I've started to develop an appreciation for that. Yeah. Or perhaps I'm just attracted to that idea. And I think a lot of the kind of new pagan worship, which is associated with, an idea of respecting the environment, I think that's trying to reconnect with that idea.
We've had Julian Goodyear talking on about pagans sort of connecting with the history of women that were accused as witches and saying, actually, that wasn't the right connection to make. It wasn't there, but perhaps paganism reaches back before that, the times of the persecution. I would like to come on and speak about the television series in a further bit. I think you've mentioned a couple of women. Were there any more women that you'd like to name?
Yes, I'll just list them for you if you like. So then we're looking at a case in 1688 in Boston. And the reason we're looking at this case is because it is about an Irish-speaking woman who was living in Boston, Puritan community there as an indentured servant. Her name was Anne Glover. It's believed she lost her husband in the Caribbean as an indentured servant, although this can't be proven. But we know that she was in Boston as a widow with a young daughter in the 1680s, and she was working for the family of John Goodwin. And she was, as an Irish speaker, English was her second language. So she really didn't have a lot of English, which may have made life a little bit difficult. However, she was involved with menial work. When the daughter of John Goodwin, Martha Goodwin, she accused Anne's daughter, Mary, of stealing laundry. And there was an argument that ensued. And from that, Martha then believed that she had been bewitched by Goody Glover, Anne Glover. And in fact, that her three brothers and sisters were also bewitched. So the four Goodwin children.
You were saying there the four Goodwin children were said to have been bewitched by her.
That's right.
And this just came from an initial allegation of the theft of laundry.
It is, yeah, to which Goody Glover objected, and she defended herself and her daughter. But then this is what played out. So what happened, as an Irish speaker, she was a Catholic too. So this wouldn't have been viewed very positively in a Puritan community in Boston. It was a very controlled environment. I mean, if people dozed in church, they would be hit with a stick. It was a very, 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 fierce culture of control. And perhaps this community could be even seen as more extreme in terms of Puritanism than others, because that's why they went there in the first place, was to establish a kind of a new order. So she was hung on Boston Common as a witch. And, when she was being interrogated, she was actually assessed psychologically by 6 doctors to see if she was, in inverted commas, crazed in her intellectuals.
Did I catch you correctly there? She was actually assessed by 6 doctors.
She was.
And what was the reason? What was the reason for that?
Well, you see, she was an Irish speaker, so therefore they couldn't probably make head nor tail of a lot of what she was saying, even in English. So they may have just thought she was mad.
And so they got doctors to assess her, to assess that she wasn't mad.
That's right.
And then on finding out that she wasn't mad, they executed her as a witch.
They did. And in fact, she also was reciting the Lord's Prayer in Irish, and this was interpreted as satanic incantations.
That's absolutely tragic.
Yeah, it is tragic. It is tragic. So that case gives us a lens on the colonial context as well. And also the linguistic divide. There is a memorial plaque in Boston that suggests that she was a Catholic martyr, but I don't think that was the case. It just happened that she was Catholic.
I see. And there's a great irony there in having so many doctors trying to assess somebody to see whether they're mad or not, and then finding out they're not mad, they execute them as a witch. They should really have been looking at themselves and assessing whether or not they were mad.
Well, exactly. And they also found puppets, little puppets that she had made out of cloth. And so there was this sort of possible association with voodoo. However, she could have been making them for her child. They could have been child's dolls. They could have been anything. But these kinds of little icons, I'd say they would have been quite common at the time. I don't know that you could project any kind of demonic associations onto them. So one way or another, the evidence stacked against her.
Oh, absolutely terrible. So I think we've covered maybe about 3 or 4 women that were convicted as witches. How many of them were there in total that you're looking at?
We look at 2 other cases. One was in Antrim in 1698. An unknown peasant woman was accused of bewitching a child, but it never went to court because she was strangled and burned by a mob.
So there was just mob justice. Yeah. There was no trial.
That's right. That was an extrajudicial killing of a suspected witch in Antrim town in 1698. That case, obviously, we don't know anything. We don't know the woman's name. We know very little about her. And so then we come to the biggest trial in Ireland in terms of witchcraft trials, which was in Ireland Magee in 1711. And 8 women and 1 man were accused of being witches. So it's a classic case of a younger woman, which happens a lot. This is a dynamic in many of these cases that we're exploring, is there's a younger woman, often a servant, who accuses an older woman, often a beggar. Basically, an elderly widow of a Presbyterian minister who was staying in her son's house started to have spectral visions. She was having demonic apparitions, and suddenly she died. So this was interpreted as a bewitchment, but at the time there was no one under the spotlight for the crime, if you like. A visitor comes to stay with her son's daughter, and she starts to experience supernatural disturbances. And she accuses 8 women from the surrounding area of bewitching her. So she accuses, I'll name the women, Janet Carson. There's a lot of Janets in this list. Janet Carson, Janet Seller, her daughter Elizabeth Seller, Catherine McAlmond, Janet Mean, Janet Latimer, Janet Miller, and Margaret Mitchell. And later, William Seller, who's the husband and father to the convicted women, Janet and Elizabeth Seller, he was later executed as a witch. So just to tell you what happened, all of these women were either disabled, they were old, they were poor, they were hard drinking, hard smoking ladies, they were wild women. They weren't executed as witches, they were convicted of bewitching Mary Dunbar, but they were not convicted of the murder of Anne Holtridge. So therefore their punishment was a year in jail and then 4 sessions in the pillory in the market, which is in the stocks where people could throw things at them. And in fact, one woman lost an eye.
I mean, it's interesting
in the process.
Even over in Ireland, when people were being convicted of the crime, they weren't receiving a mandatory execution. It appears that there were lesser sentences that could be carried out on them.
That's true. Ireland was under British law. There were more barriers to executing a witch than there were in Scotland, I believe. You'd be probably more of an expert on this, Claire, but I believe that it wasn't as easy, if you like, to carry out an execution on a witch.
The Witchcraft Act that we're talking about in our podcast, the Witchcraft Act gave the mandatory sentence, and the mandatory sentence was execution. So there were no bars to it. In fact, that was what you got. Some people weren't executed. And we've had an example before of someone being described as half guilty. That seems like a little bit of a dodge, but they managed to escape being executed. But certainly from what you've said to me in Ireland, it's quite clear that it wasn't a mandatory execution.
No, but Mary Dunbar, who made the accusations, she died 3 weeks later. And so William Seller, who was the husband and father to 2 of the convicted women, he was executed.
He executed for witchcraft, which caused the accuser's death?
He was. And Andrew Snedden, very recently, Andrew Snedden, a historian in Ireland, he recently found this out. So this evidence has really just come to light. So this was a male witch who was executed in Ireland.
I mean, we've spoken about the numbers in Scotland before, and the fact that across Europe it was about 80%. That's obviously broadly, and some higher, some was lower, but about 80% over Europe. In Scotland, it was about 85%, so even more were women. And possibly it appears the split would be even higher in Ireland, albeit so few women, thankfully so few women executed as witches in Ireland. We're obviously at Witches of Scotland trying to get a national memorial for the women and men that were convicted as witches. Was there any attempt, or has there been any attempt to memorialise those women killed as witches in Ireland?
Not in a collective way, no. However, in Island Magee, which was the biggest case where there were 8 women and 1 man, there was an effort to establish a memorial there. However, a local councillor objected to the memorial, and he believed that it would become a shrine to paganism, and he remained to be convinced that the women were not actually guilty of devil worship.
So he thought that people would then come as pagans to worship there or something? Was that the idea?
I have no idea. I suppose that you can presume from that he still believes in the idea of witches. To be perfectly honest as well, looking at all of these cases, for example, if you do a Google search on Florence Newton, you'll see the Witch of Youghal, Florence Newton. And, they use lithographs of, various different depictions of the court cases at the time, with this woman pointing and all the men around looking horrified. So, we would really like to add some new narratives into the algorithm, as in just the hashtag Florence Newton, not a witch, a powerful woman, just so that people have alternative stories that they can find in the machine, because I find that really problematic that she's still called that hasn't been addressed. And perhaps too, because we're looking at the history of colonization, I suppose as well, that those narratives are not, they don't come into the kind of history of women or the studies of women in Ireland, because they're seen as kind of separate. Yeah, but they're not.
We called our campaign Witches of Scotland, and people were quite surprised. These women weren't witches, and that's absolutely my point. They weren't witches, but they've been convicted as people under the Witchcraft Act, so they were known as witches. And my point is, we really want to change that narrative, and we want to get these women pardoned so we can change the phrase the Witches of Scotland to the Women of Scotland.
Exactly. And I was really taken by the story you told of Lilia Sadie. Just the idea of humanizing her. I can see her in my mind's eye now as a young woman. And then when you put that in context of what happened to her, it's really difficult to believe. So, the idea of reclaiming these women's names now is very powerful.
We feel so. We feel it's important. Now, you are going to be bringing this to us on the screen, as it were. You've got the 6-part show. Can you tell us a wee bit more about it, where we can see it, things like that?
Sure. So the series is called Mra Warlocht, The Persecuted. And Mra Warlocht is a strange word. It's a word I found in an old dictionary, and it translates as womanish ways, in the sense that, you can't quite trust them. So because that was sort of, I suppose, the view of women at the time. Also, it's just it's just really nice to say in Irish, Mra Warlocht. But the series will be examining the cases in Ireland, but also looking at the context of Gaelic Ireland and why the witch hunts didn't take off in the same way in Ireland. It's quite an exception in Europe. So we have a lot of people theorizing about this. There's many different views. The series will be broadcast in 2021, probably around Halloween, which is quite interesting. Of course, a series about anything to do with witches will be broadcast at Halloween, but I like to think that this will give people something that they weren't quite expecting. And it will be on TG Cara, which is the Irish language TV channel,
so hopefully
and
there
BBC
might be
Northern
a possibility
Ireland.
That we'll be able to see it at some point, be it put online or something like that.
Absolutely. Yes, it will be put online. And also, Scotland's just become a lot bigger in the series, because we realise that there's the Ulster Scots connection, but there's so much in common between Scotland and Ireland culturally and with regard to traditional beliefs. But also there's this religious divide, I suppose. And then with plantation, we had so many Scottish people coming in as plantation people in Northern Ireland. So the connection is so strong. In order to give us a clear picture of what happened during the witch hunts, going to Scotland was really important, and it started to become, I hate to say that Scotland's the mothership, but in a way we felt that we couldn't tell this story without speaking to people in Scotland, and particularly hearing that there is a campaign to clear the women's names, to pardon them. It felt like it was really amazing timing.
I was so delighted to hear about the work that you were doing, and I just felt it was so interesting. And being of Irish descent myself, I was very interested to see the very different way that the allegations of witchcraft were dealt with in Ireland than in Scotland, and what the various reasons for that might be, both in Southern Ireland and in Northern Ireland. Am I right in saying that in Southern Ireland there was only one recorded instance of witchcraft?
That's right, yes. I mean, there is the Alice Keitler case where her servant Petronella Demise was executed, but that was a heresy case.
It's quite incredible, such a short distance across the water, what was happening in Scotland.
Well, true. And also that was a Cromwellian community. That was a walled community. It was a colonial enclave to keep the Gaelic native population out.
I really, really look forward to the programme to look at the different theories that are no doubt abound as to why that is, why people thought Southern Ireland and the native Gaelic people of Ireland were immune from the allegations of witchcraft. It seems bizarre, but it definitely seems something, because it's so unusual throughout the whole of Europe, it definitely seems something very, very worthwhile. So I'm absolutely delighted that you're doing your programme and we're going to be able to find out about that.
Once again this week, thank you so much for listening to the Witches of Scotland podcast. We're really hitting some really good numbers for people listening, but it's important as ever, when you listen, if you can, please recommend us to other people, please share on social media, and please rate us, because of course, the more listeners, the more people that are engaged with the campaign, the higher a chance of success we have.
If you'd like to learn more about the Witches of Scotland, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Sign up for our mailing list at www.witchesofscotland.com to keep updated with the campaign. On that site, you'll be able to find how to link with us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.